deep appreciation to everyone who has been involved in the logistics of making my physical presence here in Louisville possible and ensuring access, abundant access tonight. I come to this work at the intersection of several worlds. I am a scholar, I am a rabbi, I am a disability activist. And it is a joy to be able to share some of the work I unfold in my book, Loving Our Own Bones, Disability Wisdom, and the Spiritual Subversiveness of Knowing Ourselves Whole. When I speak about disability wisdom, I mean the powerful countercultural work unfolding in disability communities today. The work to honor and embrace our actual bodies and minds in all their vibrancy and complexity. Ableism, disability stigma, and violence. And the work to center gentleness and rest, to refuse that siren song of productivity and honor instead softness and slowness, spaciousness and care. In tonight's talk, I want to lift up a core commitment that I see at the heart of disability culture, a fierce and unabashed commitment to insisting on the worthiness, the brilliance, and the value of disabled people's lives in a world that so often treats us like trash. I name that work as sacred. That conviction that we can help each other learn to spit out poison, to release the barbs that ableism sinks into our minds and flesh, that conviction that we deserve a world that welcomes us, that we can and must transform patterns of exclusion, violence, and disdain, that is sacred work. That is the most sacred work I know. So in my talk today, I'll aim to show how disability wisdom can transform the way we read the Bible and other sacred texts. I'll lay out why I think it matters to recognize disability as a justice issue, why I want to see religious communities build political solidarity with disabled people as one way of living out our core spiritual commitments. And finally, I'll aim to show how and why I think disability wisdom can be a potent provocation for theology, how disability can shiver something vital and new into the ways we name and know God. So before I go further, let me say a word about what I mean when I talk about disability. Disability is a diverse category. It unfolds in 1,000 different ways. Some disabilities are visible, but the vast majority of disabilities are not apparent at first glance. When I speak about disability, I'm thinking expansively. Physical disabilities, sensory disabilities, cognitive and intellectual disabilities, neurodivergence and neurodiversity, mental health disabilities, depression, anxiety, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, long COVID, to name just a few. When I'm thinking about disability, I'm thinking about difference, about body-mind difference. But even more importantly, I am thinking about the way that difference so often gets refused. We live in a world that is set up to accommodate certain kinds of bodies and minds, to offer access to some while pushing others to the margins. That's what I mean when I talk about ableism. Ableism is a complex set of social structures, policies, norms, and attitudes that marginalize people with disabilities and people who are thought to be disabled. Ableism is about power. It's about the way certain bodies and minds get treated as normal, while others get cast as abnormal, inferior, and undesirable. When I talk about ableism, I mean systems and structures that deny disabled people access, agency, resources, and self-determination. I mean concrete, tangible practices of injustice. There's a Jewish story I like to tell to illustrate ableism in action. Oh, do you need to pause? Go ahead. Okay. It is a story from the Talmud, a 6th century rabbinic Jewish text that is a foundational cornerstone for Jewish law and practice. In the Talmud, the rabbis tell a powerful set of stories about the world's most wicked city. That is the city of Sodom from Genesis 19. Now, whenever I talk about this story and this city, I always preface it by saying, as a queer person myself, the very word Sodom can sometimes make me flinch, right? Because there is a long history of using this text, this story, this biblical moment as an anti-gay text. But that's not where I'm going. That is a terrible misreading of this story. Formative voices in both Jewish and Christian tradition, the rabbis who crafted the Talmud and the Christian church fathers, lifted up this story for very different purpose. Ancient Christian and Jewish writers understood Sodom's wrongdoing in light of a powerful passage in Ezekiel, a passage that describes the, quote, guilt of your sister Sodom as a place where people had abundant food and prosperous ease, but turned away from people in need. That verse, that's from Ezekiel 16:49. So the rabbis and the church fathers don't associate Sodom with sexual sin. Instead, they say the sin of Sodom is a failure of hospitality. It's the practice of cruelty, violence, brutality, and greed. The Talmud tells a whole series of stories about that wicked city. They want to unveil the violence that reigned there and remind us of what we must guard against, what we must never do. The question they ask is, what was the cruelty of that city like? So here's the story that I want to connect to the violence of ableism. The rabbis teach, in that wicked city they had one certain bed on which they laid each and every guest. And if a person was too tall, they cut off his feet. And if a person was too short, they stretched him out until he fit. Of course, the rabbis don't frame it in exactly these terms, but I find this to be a powerful story for thinking about ableism. This is a story about the kind of violence that happens when we force everyone, every body, every mind into the same too tight box. When we assume everybody's body and everybody's mind better fit the same bed or else face the hatchet. We live in a world that would rather chop us up and spit us out than cherish the real, riotous, actual diversity of all human kinds. Ableism is baked into the way we've built this world, from the physical architecture of our cities and churches to the basic expectations of our schools and our workplaces. It's all those expectations about time and pace and productivity, all those ways we choose to bow to the altar of efficiency, all those ways we make it clear whose bodies and minds belong. One of the reasons it is so crucial to put anti-ableist practice at the center of our justice work is because it helps us shift the frame. Rather than trying to fix people's bodies and minds so they all fit neatly into that one same bed, I want us to build a world that values difference, that plans for it and embraces it, that cherishes disabled people, that cherishes all of us as we are. Every disabled person I know has stories about living in a world that doesn't want us. The cost of living in a world that didn't plan for us. We get shut out. We get pushed aside. We get left behind. But I also want to tell you another truth, one that I think is not as frequently spoken. Ableism hurts all of us. Ableism isn't good for anybody or any mind. Now, of course, it's crucial to center the fact that disabled people bear the brunt of ableist violence. I want us to hold that truth first and foremost so we do not erase the material costs of harm. But ableism also hurts non-disabled people. Let me draw out one example to tell you what I mean. One of the ways that ableism works is that it makes a fetish out of productivity. Ableism sets up accomplishment as a litmus test for human value. It tries to sell us a lie, that our fundamental worth is tied to our work, that our value as people is rooted in what we can do. Now, that lie, of course, hits hardest against a lot of people with disabilities. Many of us live with pain. Many of us live with more intense fatigue. Some of us can't work. Or some of us need accommodations that all too often get refused. But that lie that work is what makes us worthy, that lie hurts all of us. Ableism is that fear that gnaws so many of us in the night, that we are only as good as our last accomplishment, that if we're feeling bad, we better fake it, that we only matter if we are healthy, wealthy, and well. I think of all the people I know who cannot afford to call in sick, about all the people who drag themselves to work regardless of how they feel. Part of this, of course, is a matter of public policy. Not enough sick time, not enough family leave. Part of it's about economics, about living paycheck to paycheck, just barely skating by. But part of it is also about the way that ableism sinks inside our skins, the way we've swallowed that lie. So many of us have never been taught to turn with gentleness toward our own bodies. We've never been taught to hold with tenderness the very fact of our own softness. Instead, we're forever pushing back a fundamental fact of being human. All our bodies and minds will shift and change. We all need rest. We all deserve care. We all deserve a world that welcomes us, actually us. In Loving Our Own Bones, part of the work I do is to bring this kind of disability wisdom into conversation with biblical text and tradition. So I want to turn tonight to a biblical figure I find deeply resonant for drawing out disability insight. That's the prophet Moses. Jewish tradition honors Moses as the preeminent prophet, the man who speaks to God face to face. But it's ironic, actually, because Moses is no confident speaker. In Exodus 4:10, Moses describes himself as not a man of words. The Hebrew words he uses to describe his mouth and tongue, kvad peh u kvad lashon. Well, he uses a Hebrew phrase that evokes kvad, kavod, heaviness, and effort. Many traditional Jewish sources describe Moses as having a stutter or some kind of speech disability. So let's begin here with the powerful recognition that Moses is a disabled prophet whose disability is recognized and affirmed by God. All right, so maybe you know this story. The Israelite people are enslaved in Egypt, oppressed by a cruel Pharaoh and suffering deeply. God hears their cry and resolves to send Moses to Pharaoh to free the people from their bondage. But Moses has deep doubts. Basically, in no uncertain terms, Moses doesn't want to do it. Right? He says, "Please, Lord, make someone else your agent." Now, I am inclined to read this moment in two ways at once. First, I take Moses' hesitation as a witness to the way internalized ableism can creep into our hearts. Right? It's that voice that says, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not the right person for the job. If I go, maybe I'll be a complication. Maybe I'll be a burden. But there's also a way in which I see Moses in this moment reckoning with the reality of disability stigma, acknowledging that he too lives in a world not unlike our own, a world where people make harsh judgments about disability and disabled people, a world where exclusion and marginalization are commonplace. In such a world, is Pharaoh going to listen to a disabled messenger? Either way, the Torah's response, the Bible's response, is powerful. When Moses says he's not a man of words, God responds with a powerful, iconic line. Who makes a man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf, sighted or blind? Is it not I, the Eternal? That's Exodus 4:11. Deaf Rabbi Darby Lee talks about the power of those words, the way they anchored him as a deaf child, the way they allowed him to feel that he had been created deaf, as opposed to his deafness being an error or an aberration. It's a powerful moment in the Torah for me, a moment that recognizes disability as part of the very fiber of Moses' being. So in the next verse, Exodus 4:12, God reassures Moses. Now go, God says. Now go, and I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you what to say. I want to linger for a moment with that phrase. I'll be with you as I speak. The original Hebrew of this verse is beautifully intimate and embodied. It reads, Va'anochi yeh im picha. Translated more literally, it means, I, God, will be with your mouth. And that verb, ehyeh, It's part of the way God names God's self when God first speaks to Moses at the burning bush. Moses says, "Who are you?" And God answers, "Ehyeh asher ehyeh." I will be who I will be. That same verb, ehyeh, appears again in our verse, this verse, to describe how God will be with Moses. Not some abstract, amorphous sense of, I'll be with you, but a visceral, tangible, intimate presence. I will be with, in, among your mouth. God's presence is in the very particulars of Moses' mouth, in the very place where Moses might have imagined God to be absent. So I want to tell you, this verse has become something of a touchstone for me. Somewhere I turn to when I am feeling frustrated with my own disabled bones, when I'm in pain, when I'm grappling with loss or frustration or shame. Some days I lay my hand on my knee or my hip or my thigh, those places where I feel my own disability most acutely. And I just whisper those words to myself like balm. I let myself summon forth a little bit of that gentleness that God offers to Moses, that promise of presence. I'm with you. I'm here, in your mouth, in your ache, in your bones. I believe we can teach ourselves tenderness. I believe we can learn to offer ourselves love. So I've been talking just now about the inner work, the soul work we can practice to unlearn some of the ways that ableism gets inside our skin. But when we contend with ableism, I also want us to couple that potent inner work with a commitment to shifting the norms and expectations of the world in which we live. So here too, I think the Exodus story offers a powerful example of access in practice. In Exodus 4, as we've seen, God tells Moses to go and speak with Pharaoh. When Moses hesitates, when Moses discloses his own disability, when Moses says, "I can't do this thing, at least not in the way that you imagine," God meets Moses's access needs. God says, "Okay, fine. Take Aaron, your brother. Let him repeat your words." It is a moment we might call the first reasonable accommodation in the Bible. A moment where we see Moses advocate successfully with God and receive the support and the access that he needs and deserves. It is for me a beautiful moment and a powerful reminder that disabled people deserve a world of abundant access, a world that offers us kinship and community and generous support. That's what I want for us. Okay, but before we land in that place of abundant access, if you know this text well, you know there is a hitch. There is a place where the biblical text lets me down. We have this gorgeous exchange between Moses and God. Moses says, "I'm the wrong guy for the job. God, please send somebody else." And in response, eventually, God works out a new plan. Moses and Aaron will go together. Aaron will repeat Moses' words. He becomes the first known revoicer right? To make sure that the people will understand. But right before that, right before we land in that happy place, right before God offers Moses the accommodation, Exodus 4:14 begins with these words. God became angry with Moses. I'll be honest with you. Those words feel like a knife in my heart. They feel like salt in a still open wound because they name one of the hard truths of living in an ableist world. When disabled people speak about our needs, when we ask for support, when we acknowledge disability and ask others to acknowledge disability, we open ourselves up to anger. We open ourselves up to frustration. We open ourselves up to the vulnerability of being denied. I don't want to paper over that pain. I want us to acknowledge it. I want us to bear witness. But I also want to open up a different possibility. For years, I read this text as though God was an inflexible boss, right? An unforgiving taskmaster. I read that flash of God's frustration as a failure of empathy, as a refusal to offer Moses the care and regard that Moses deserves. But what if that isn't it? What if that's not what's going on here? Right? This is where I want to crack open another possibility. What if that moment of divine anger reflects something of God's own vulnerability? What if it's an expression of God's own risk? What if it's a witness to God's own need? What if God also has access needs? Now, I don't know how you imagine God, or how you think about God's presence or God's power. It has been my experience that most of us default to the notion that God is all everything, right? All powerful, all capable, all authority, all in charge, all the time. Right? We are used to thinking of God as in charge of everything. God is always in control. God is utterly self-assured. God is able to do anything and everything alone. But here's the thing. Thinking theologically through the prism of disability has given me a radically different perspective. I no longer think of God as distant from disability. I think of God as one who knows disability from the inside. So let's imagine the scene from a very different perspective. What if God also has access needs? What if God can't do God's work in the world without Moses? Without me? Without you? What if God needs us? I don't mean some gauzy notion of mutual appreciation. I mean need, the way disabled people know. The way I can't lift a stack of books or drive myself to the store. The way my friend can't get out of bed until her care attendant comes. What if God needs us in a way that is visceral and vulnerable? What if God, in fact, relies on us? Are we going to show? There's a biblical verse just a few lines later in the Exodus story that gives us, I think, a very potent glimpse of this possibility. God is describing the really intricate arrangement that will unfold to support Moses as he brings God's word to Pharaoh. In Exodus 4:16, God says to Moses, he, that is Aaron, will speak for you, Moses, to the people. Aaron will be your mouth, and you, Moses, will be like God to him. Now that is a very curious phrase. You will be like God. Moses is like God to Aaron. What do we make of that? Well, in truth, many translators and commentators blunt the force of this claim. The influential medieval Jewish commentator Rashi, for example, says, our verse just means Moses will be Aaron's superior. Don't worry, Moses is in charge. But I am curious about what happens if we take this verse really seriously. If we let it tell us something about the nature of God's power. Moses both directs and simultaneously depends on Aaron. Moses is both in charge and in need in the very same moment. What if that dance of power and vulnerability mirrors God's own way of working in the world? God has power, of course, but perhaps God's position is also in some way precarious. As far as I can tell, God can't pick up a single stone without a human hand to lift it. God can't do God's work alone. This is terrain that many disabled people know intimately. A friend of mine with a neuromuscular disability describes how disability has honed her capacity for delegation and direction. She is an expert at orchestrating other people's hands because that's the way she gets things done. The only way she gets things done. That's what I think about when I think about God's power. Right? I think about God as always convincing and cajoling us, trying to marshal a fractious, frankly unreliable staff of human beings to do God's work in this world. How precarious it is. How flush with possibility, but also how intensely frustrating. In disability community, we often talk about the beauty and the power of interdependence, the bone-deep recognition that we need each other, that none of us can make it in this world alone. But I want to be real with you. I want to also name the risk, the vulnerability, the frustration, and the fear when interdependence is a way of life. I cannot tell this story without bringing us back to this very particular moment. We are living in a moment where the concrete care systems that support disabled people's lives are under profound attack. When the tangible, material funding and support and resources that disabled people need to live are being torn apart. If Medicaid is defunded, millions of disabled people will lose access to our health care. Medicaid is a lifeline for so many people I love. Friends and comrades, activists and artists, my colleagues' family, my neighbor's kid. If Medicaid is cut, millions of us will lose access to the care workers we need in order to live in our own homes and communities. So when I say that it matters that religious communities recognize disability as a justice issue, that religious communities take up the call to confront ableism. I don't just mean God and Moses and an ancient story from long ago. I mean, I want us to fight hard for a world here and now where we all have access to health care, for a world where disabled people have the resources we need to live and to flourish and to thrive. That's what I'm here for. That's what I want. When I think about that world I want to build right here and now for all of us, I think about a world that knows and honors the brilliance of disability difference. So to glimpse what I mean, I want to draw one more strand from this Moses story. It unfolds right after Moses first encounters God at the burning bush. God asks Moses to speak to his own community, not Pharaoh this time, but his own people. God says, tell them who I am. Share my promise. Share my presence. Tell them I'm with them. Here too, Moses hesitates. In Exodus 4:1, Moses asks, what if they do not believe me and they do not listen to my voice? It is such a raw and aching moment. It is a moment when Moses lays out that fear that his words, his speech, his disabled self will not be enough. And in response, God grants Moses the gift of signs. In Exodus 4, God offers Moses 3 signs, 3 ways that Moses can communicate through visual, gestural language. It is such a powerful moment of disability embrace. It is a moment where God says, go ahead, use the visual. Don't be forced into words. Don't be forced to twist yourself into knots. Express yourself in a way that aligns with your own affinity. Bring this revelation into the world in a way that aligns with your own true being. All too often, disabled people are expected. We are expected to minimize our difference, to cover or pass or twist ourselves into the tiniest little space in order to fit into non-disabled norms and to not make any trouble. We live in a world that wants to shrink us. But I want our lives to be as wide as the sky. That's what I want for us. I want the fierce, feral dreaming that disabled folks do when we get the world's tight-pressed norms off our backs, when we strip away that too tight skin and make our own wild magic. I want the live wire brilliance that disability can bring to spiritual life and religious community. I want to let the juiciness of disability wisdom help us feel and dream and imagine something new. So let me tell you one more story. A story about what I mean. It's a story of finding unexpected recognition, of finding God in the mirror of my own flesh. So it was years ago, a decade, maybe more at this point. I was on the Jewish holiday of Shavuot, the day Jews celebrate the giving of the Torah, the gift of revelation. And in synagogue that morning, I heard the reader chant, as the reader always does, the ancient words of the prophet Ezekiel, the Hebrew prophet who had an extraordinary vision, not actually of God, God's self, but of God's immense chariot and its huge, brilliant, glistening, shimmering wheels. It was electric. It shivered down my spine, a delicious, true, deep knowing. God has wheels. Yes. Ezekiel sees God in a radiant fire, borne on a vast chariot, lifted up by 4 angelic creatures with fused legs, lustrous wings, and great wheels. It's the wheels that Ezekiel lingers with. The wheels he can't get enough of. The biblical text is lush with wheel love. The wheels gleam like beryl, he tells us. They are wheels within wheels. And then the verse that feels like it was written just for me, the living Spirit is in the wheels. What can I tell you about that moment of kinship? How can I invite you in? To make that moment come alive, I have to give you a glimpse into my own embodied life as a wheelchair user. The incredible, fluid, sensual pleasure of rolling down a smooth, gentle grade. The way I lean into a curve. The way I feel the ground flow back into my own body. The twinned vibration of earth and wheel. This is how the holy flows through me. This intricate interplay of muscle and spin. This joy. This pleasure. These wheels. One of the things that I love about the theological potency of God on wheels, like for years, I was just like so agog with the image that's all I did with it, right? But after about, 8, 9, 10 years, I thought, okay, so what does it mean theologically? What does it give us if we think about God on wheels? There's a lot I draw out from that, but let me speak to just a little bit here. One of the things I love about the theological possibility of this image is the way that it speaks to the power of claiming and centering disability joy. It matters to claim joy. It matters to kindle it, to nourish it, to let it bathe our minds, our bodies, our breath, our bones. Joy helps us feed a fierce, rooted core of luminous, revolutionary love. Joy is a catalyst. Joy is fuel for the fight. Joy matters. Because here's the other truth I know. It isn't all joy. To move through the world on wheels isn't always a pleasure. So that's the second thing I want to name about the political and theological potency of God on wheels. It has helped me to see how God has an access problem. If God wheels through this world, then God knows the sharp frustrations of wheelchair life, the building with no elevator, the bus with the perpetually broken lift, the curb without a cut, the set of stairs in front of the closest grocer, the church, the synagogue with no accessible place to pee. When I think about God on wheels, I think God knows what it is like to make a long and lonely trace of the perimeter, to grow round and round a building searching for the one accessible route inside. God knows the haggling. God knows the negotiations at the door. God knows the longing. God knows the giving up and the slow trudge home. I mean this as a metaphor, of course. But metaphor is tactile. Metaphor is true. Spiritual seekers often lament how hard it is to find God in this world. But maybe the question we need to ask is not, where is God? But how have we shut God out? Maybe God can't get close to us because of all the barriers we've fashioned, all the norms and habits we've allowed to shape our days. When I think about these shutouts, most days it's not a conscious choice. It's not like I'm deliberately building a wall. It's a forgetting. It's a different kind of failure. It's a wall built out of 1,000 rushed decisions, the weight of a whole bunch of other pressing obligations. It's a slipshod shortcut. It's a locked door I didn't even notice. Access refused. Access denied. And let's be very clear. It's not just God we shut out of our sanctuaries. I want us to put access at the very center of our spiritual work. And I don't just mean access for wheelchair users. Disability unfolds in 1,000 different ways, and access looks different for all of us. When I talk about centering access, I mean a commitment to thinking broadly and boldly. I mean sensory access and cognitive access, braille, sign language, captions, and language access, quiet space, and cushions, and softness for our bones. Thank you, friends who brought the heaters tonight. Okay? I mean flexible schedules and rest days built in. I mean remote access and hybrid community. Hi, Zoom. I mean the 1,000 tangible practices of solidarity and mutuality and justice and care. Disability unfolds 1,000 different ways. God on wheels is just one glimpse of holy possibility, one sliver of the extraordinary diversity of disability experience. So when I talk about God on wheels, as much as I love that image, I want more. I want more. I'm thinking about a deaf God. I'm thinking about a God with Down syndrome. I ask myself what a blind God knows and how an autistic God perceives this world, what she unfolds about the nature of the sacred, how she invites us to encounter the infinite. I want to know the sacred through 1,000 disabled languages. I want to revel in the holy silence of a non-speaking God's heart. I want to build a world with you. A world that knows God thrums like a bass line in the ache of everybody, in the tenderness, in the stretch of every wing, in the curl of every hand, in the burn scars and the birthmarks, in the marrow of the bone. I want to build a world with you, a world that knows the thing we thought we had to hide might be the best beloved. The thing they told us was our flaw might be our brilliance and our beauty. I want to build that world with you. A world that wants the very difference that ableism would outlaw. A world that savors neurodiversity, that sees our singularity as a witness to infinity. I want to build that world with you. A world that prizes us, that praises our particularity. A world that can embrace our frailties. A world that celebrates and cradles us. A world that wants us here. A world that desires us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. We have an opportunity now for questions and answers. I think our current setup is not going to allow for a mic to come to you, but if you'll raise your hand and ask your question, we will do our best to repeat the question for those that are online and for everyone so that everyone can hear. Rabbi, I'll let you maybe.
Great. Sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
There's one all the way in the back.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi.
Your lecture was very empowering in the perspective of how you see disability. And I know that a lot of people with disabilities don't have such an empowering perspective. So how would you encourage them to learn to love what the Lord was talking to them?
Oh, this is such a beautiful question. You said, how would you encourage other people with disabilities to learn to love what the world has taught us to hate? I want to hold that question for a moment because that question matters so much. In so many ways, I think that question is at the core of my work. Right? And it's a question that I hold close because it is a question that is still a part of my own life. Right? I don't know if that question ever fully goes away, right? I don't know if we ever fully graduate from internalized ableism or internalized oppression of any and every kind. I think that we develop skills and strategies and tools for spitting out poison. And I think we build community around us that helps us learn to do it. That's what I hope, right? So I think about my younger self a lot, right? I mean, I think about myself as a child, how ashamed I often felt of my difference, how much I wanted to shrink it down. And I think about that sweet kid, and I just want to love on her. And that's what I want for all of us. And part of what I have come to believe is it is often hard. I feel lucky to have a few moments when I can remember vividly doing that for myself. But mostly I learned that from other disabled people. Right? I learned that magic from friends, from community, from books, from writing, right? Like, we teach each other. So I answer your question in that way because I think this is a community project, not just an individual project. And I say that because I think each of us has, God willing, the opportunity to offer seeds and glimmers of gentle possibility in that way for others and maybe even for our own selves. Okay? The disabled poet Laura Hershey of blessed memory, one of the poems of hers that is something of an anthem in a lot of disability circles is a poem titled, "You Get Proud by Practicing." And it's so true. There is a kind of summoning forth of a practice commitment that I think is also a part of it. But goodness knows, I posse up, right? I mean, I'm looking for, when I don't feel it, when I am struggling with my own sense of like, can I really ask for that? That's when I phone a friend, right? I mean, that's part of that strategy is figuring out how we don't always have to go it alone. This is for me why finding and coming into a sense of disability community has been so transformative in my own life, and why I think disability organizations and connections, right? Like friends who know how to go the distance with you. It matters so much. That's, I think, how we begin to teach each other to do that work of what I like to call disability embrace. Thank you for the beautiful question. Thank you. Yes.
My parents were deaf, and I grew up with the deaf, and were deaf, and I grew up with the deaf culture. So that deaf culture, so somewhere, especially, I was kind of curious how much you know about deaf culture, how they got it together. I can tell that story.
Beautiful. Yeah. So the question was about thinking about deaf culture, particularly with the lived experience of, you said your parents were deaf and you have deaf aunts and uncles, and so you yourself grew up really encircled in and by deaf culture, deaf community. They supported one another. That kind of mutual care and love and showing up for each other, that is a cornerstone for me. I have had the privilege of being closely connected to some deaf friends and beloveds. I'm not an insider in deaf community, but deaf community, one of the things that I have really learned from deaf culture is the concept of deaf gain. Right? So the idea of deaf gain is that so often the hearing world sees deafness as a lack or a loss. Oh, you're hearing impaired. Right? But the deaf community, or many folks often flip that on its head and say it's not hearing loss, it's deaf gain. And that has been, for me, a really powerful, transformative concept that's been a cornerstone for my own political thinking about disability and also theological thinking. I think religiously, actually, I would say that concept of disability gain. What does disability offer to the world? What does disability offer to my life? What does it offer to my religious and theological understanding? What does it offer to my reading of texts? That emerges, I mean, I owe that insight to deaf culture, right? And that sense of just saying, no, you don't know, to the hearing world that often assumes deafness should be so small and meager.
It is kind of scary. My father died and we met the minister. The first thing I said to him was, don't you dare say he hears.
Don't you dare say he hears in heaven. So I said this a little bit earlier when I was having a conversation with some students, but I'll repeat it now. Jewish tradition is somewhat agnostic on the question of like the hereafter and heaven, the world to come in Jewish thought. There's a lot of different Jewish ideas about what if there is an afterlife, what it is like. But I gotta tell you, if there is a heaven, it sure as heck better be wheelchair accessible, right? I want to take these wheels finally into a space that is beautifully, brilliantly made with disability in mind. Thank you. That idea. And of course, you know, I mean, I like to think, again, I'm kind of speaking here from my own Jewish space of like, I think the world to come is a choose your own adventure, right? So you're all warmly welcome, not that you need my permission, right? Warmly welcome to imagine your own afterlife. But I think that recognition that it is a violence, in fact, to assume that disabled people will be remade in some normative image. I mean, first, it's just a big failure of imagination, right? But it also imposes the idea of normativity. Oh, what's a good body? What's a good mind? What's a good way of moving through the world? What's the right way to communicate? I mean, come on. What kind of hubris is that? But it runs very deep in so many of our assumptions about what the ideal life is like. Both, and let's be clear, it's not just it's not just the heavenly world. We do this also when we think about the idealization of particular body minds, particular ways of being in the world, in this world as well. Right? We assume certain people's lives are like inherently tragic, or it would be so much better if you could walk or whatever. I mean, anyway. So I just want to say no to that, not just religiously, but in so many of the ways that this kind of thinking unfolds in the world. I'm actually really deeply invested in the idea of proliferating many different possibilities, right? So that there's more space, more spaciousness for many different ways of inhabiting this world and many different ways of feeling ourselves into bodies and minds. I've been speaking mostly about disability tonight, but of course, and this question about normativity is something that this cuts across so many different identities and experiences, right? So many of us know the stigma, the pain, the violation, the loss, that too tight box, right? I mean, that box cuts against so many of us in so many different ways. And so this is a place where I think also there's so much potential for making common cause, thinking across different axes of difference, of marginality, of recognizing the way in which that assumption that there's only one good, right way to have a body or be in this world. We just got to break that down. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
In your book, you write about the interest with the story of Belser, specifically I guess you're thinking about some of the dangers of that, where it's divinely ordained.
Yeah, so there's a midrash that I talk about in my book that describes Moses. It's like a origin story for Moses' disability. How does Moses get his right? How does he acquire his speech disability? And There's a tradition that, in fact, he acquires his speech disability in part because he reaches for a burning and burns his tongue, basically, rather than reaching for a crown of gold. And he was, of course, if you know the Moses story, you know that he grew up in the court of Pharaoh. And this whole midrash is basically a test from Pharaoh to say, is this kid going to rival me? Is he going to be an upstart? Is he going to be a danger? Should I get rid of him now? And Moses makes the right choice that proves his spiritual goodness and also means he acquires a disability. And your very, very perceptive comment is to ask about the dangers of this kind of story. Yeah. I feel really ambivalent about this midrash. I mean, in some ways, it's certainly better than there's a lot of material that assumes disability is a negative. Right? There's a lot of traditional religious material in both Jewish and Christian and many other religious communities, religious traditions that treats disability as in negative terms. And so sometimes there's a tendency to want to seize hold of anything that isn't absolutely gross. Right? It's not abjectly terrible, so I'll take it. The problem with taking it, though, is that there's a spiritualizing here that I think is really dangerous. There's a spiritualizing that is present in the idea of it's sort of a motif, everything happens for a reason. Oh, your disability is a sign of some great spiritual insight. I mean, spare me. Right? This is such freighted material, and sometimes it's actually harder to navigate than the overtly negative material because it's meant really well. It's meant really kindly. So it's I find it gross, but I can't, I don't want to. So that's a bind. I think one of the things that I would say is that, of course, sometimes people do find significant spiritual meaning and insight in their own disability experience. And sometimes these origin stories, this is how what happened, this is how and why what unfolded in my life, whether it's part of what, unfolded in the womb, right? Or unfolded over the course of the life. Sometimes these origin stories matter to us. Sometimes they become really important as a way of thinking about and making sense of our own disability experience. So if that is people's, when that is somebody's experience, I think it's marvelous if you have found a story that works well for you. Where I think we run into a lot of danger is the tendency to script those stories on other people. Right? The risk is taking a nice story about the spiritual meaning of disability and plopping it on somebody else's head, right? Forcing somebody else to bear that story, right? Of spiritual chosenness, of great enlightenment, of being a spiritual teacher, whatever, right? I think that is a place where I think proceed with great caution. I would like us to be very, very careful of the meaning-making work. That so often we want to force disability to mean something, especially in religious communities. I actually sometimes want disability to just be. It's just like a fact. It's just So I talk about disability embrace. I like the idea of disability embrace, but I think there's also something really to be said about disability neutrality. It's just true facts, I use a wheelchair. It's just how it is, right? It doesn't have to be part of some big script or big story. I don't have to turn it into something. I mean, I did, so it's a little bit of an awkward situation for me to tell you the story because I'm deeply professionally engaged in making meaning theologically out of disability. But I just want to say, let's also allow it to be. And I think one of the things that's really central to my own theological work is that I am profoundly committed, deeply committed to allowing disability experience to be its own complex thing. And then to ask, okay, what do I know religiously, spiritually, theologically because of disability experience. Somehow that feels different than that like too smooth script that wants to make neat, easy meaning out of somebody else's disability. Thank you. Okay, question here.
This will be our
great.
last one, friends. We
Okay.
want- yeah.
Yeah. Rabbi,
Yes.
I really enjoyed this presentation. But if I go to heaven,
Yes.
I'm being blind most of my life. If I go to heaven and can't see, I'm not sure I want to go there.
Well,
I'll just stay here.
well, that's lovely. I feel like this is again, so I would say two things. First of all, I would say I fall back on the idea of I believe, I think what I'm most committed to actually is our own agency in scripting, in shaping a future that feels generative and meaningful and abundant. It's not actually what that future is, the specifics, right? What I want in my longed for future and what you might want could be quite different. What I want is for us to have the space, the cultural, personal, political, religious, theological space to be able to imagine abundant possibilities that do not assume there is only one answer to the question of what makes a good life and what makes a life worth living. So I wish you, as I wish us all, a heaven that is exactly the heaven of your own body, mind's yearning. But even more than that, I want to say, I wish us all the courage and the conviction and the holy boldness to not wait for heaven. Because let's do that here and now. That's also what I want for us, for all of us. Thank you.